Hello. So I haven't made a video in a while, and life decided to finally stop getting in the way, so here we are. Except this time we get to talk about good old video games. And as much as I want this video to be purely about Elden Ring, I may or may not devolve into talking about video game design as a whole, as I have had a lot of thoughts about this swimming in my head for years now. The open world formula is something that has been discussed for well over a decade at this point in the gaming community. And admittedly, I've never really been too positive about it, and I think it's for a good reason. Open world is no longer this cool, revolutionary idea to me anymore, and now it just kind of feels like the standard for high-budget gaming productions. And because of that standard, it leaves a lot of games released in the last decade or so feeling kind of the same. And it leads to me not really getting into a lot of these supposedly really good games, or just me skipping a lot of notable releases because I felt like I knew what to expect. See, when it comes to a new single-player experience, I want something fresh, something that can surprise me. And the open world approach was always cool, but as you sink dozens of hours into more and more of the same copy and paste style of game, it starts to weigh on you. The thing that always made single-player games for me was something related to the story, or the general lore as a whole, or maybe some unique style of combat, and these are all things that can exist in an open world game, as we will talk about later. But unfortunately, a lot of studios have used this formula as an excuse to not tell a story, or to forego any epic set pieces that give you something new and cool to do. And this general prevalence of freedom in games, opposed to a more streamlined and linear experience, have made me think about the pros and cons of it all. Because while everything I said above may be true, it's also true that a well-designed open world that is worth exploring, combined with the freedom and ability to explore everything at your own pace, also makes for a pretty fun experience. The challenge then becomes finding that game. How many of these open world games are actually worth giving a shot? How many will actually fit that criteria and rope me in? Is this whole genre just something that we're going to have to deal with for the rest of our lives? There is evidence that game developers still see open world as the superior way to make a game and tell a story, and despite all my complaints, they might not be totally wrong. Because yes, that interview with Aonuma where he basically dismissed the linear experience as inferior did annoy me a bit. But at the same time, it's also extremely frustrating to see a portion of the Zelda fanbase completely dismiss Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom just because they're open world. Meanwhile, they're still some of the best games I've ever played. So yeah, clearly I've always been a bit torn up about this debate. A more linear, story-driven game can give me one of the best narratives I could ever experience, and I would only have to spend a couple dozen hours on it, while an open world game can get me sucked into exploration and enjoying a large, complex world. So now, that brings us to Elden Ring. As of the making of this video, the first gameplay trailer for the DLC was recently shown, and I have been playing through the game yet again in preparation for its release. My first experience with Elden Ring was actually on the day of its release, and like many others, it was my first time playing a Souls-like game, unless you count like Fallen Order or something. In fact, before it came out, I didn't really know anything about From Software's games, except that they were a more dark style of fantasy, and that they were really, really hard. And when I was following all the hype and trailers for Elden Ring, I didn't even know if it was going to be a Souls-like game, because I was pretty clueless. The whole aesthetic just pulled me in, and of course the naming convention evoked another fantasy property that I enjoy, but as for the gameplay, I did not know what it was going to be like at all. But at that point in my life, I was pretty disinterested in buying any new games, and unfortunately that hasn't really changed, but I bought into the Elden Ring hype because I was curious, and going through some serious Zelda withdrawal, and I was ready to try something new in the meantime. See, Breath of the Wild was one of those really good open world games I was talking about, where I actually got sucked into the world, and 8 hours would only feel like 30 minutes. And little did I know, I would actually get to play something like that once again. Elden Ring immediately enthralled me. Aimlessly running around Limgrave for the first time gave me serious Breath of the Wild vibes, except The combat was just so much cooler to me, and I don't really know why. As a pure melee player, this entire game is basically just dodging and hitting, and yet I still can't stop fighting everything I run into. The weight of your attacks and the way the animations chain together, the fact that many weapons have unique abilities with their own animations is just so cool and refreshing to me. The enemy designs and their attacks also make them worth actually attacking, instead of other games where you randomly encounter yet another Weedle that you press a button to one-shot stress-free. In this game, it feels like even the weakest pushover can still kick your ass if you're not careful, yet for the most part you don't feel totally weak and defenseless. Unfortunately, the devs made a world that's a bit too expansive to be able to populate every nook and cranny with unique enemies and bosses, but I'll get into that later. Playing through the game for the first time without looking up any walkthroughs or item locations, which, by the way, I think is the ideal first experience for really any of these games, was just so magical. The gameplay loop of Elden Ring, if you play that way, is basically running around until you find a cool weapon or a cool set of armor and building your character around whatever you found, and then using the grace points and hints from NPCs to find the main story bosses or side dungeons that lead to side bosses. It's a simple game in that way, but Elden Ring is special in that it is an absolutely huge game. Comparing it once again to Breath of the Wild, my main complaint for that game was that it wasn't very replayable to me, because the main draw of that game is exploration, but once you've explored basically everything, then there isn't much else as far as substance. Of course, that's where a linear game with a good story starts feeling better, but that's a different subject. Elden Ring is actually quite similar, because it also has a huge emphasis on exploration, and the story is, honestly worse until you watch a couple YouTube videos and realize it's actually pretty good. But also, to be fair, it's not really much of a story, it's more like a ton of lore stitched together in a cryptic way that you can really only understand if you go out of your way to figure it out, or just let the experts figure it out for you. But Elden Ring actually rectifies the mistakes Breath of the Wild made by not only having a bigger and more intricate world to explore, but by also having a near infinite number of unique builds and playstyles. At some point in your playthrough, you will probably get to the point where it's time to Google to see if you missed out on anything cool, and this is where you usually start finding out about the hundreds of cool weapons, talismans, armor, spells, and summons that allow you to play basically however you want. And the extremely large world combined with this insane level of build customization leads Elden Ring to being such an easily replayable game. And this is also where the worries of difficulty come in. As I said before, these games are designed to be really hard, and this can scare away a lot of new players. However, if you are someone who is too scared to try any of the previous From Software titles because of the difficulty, I have some good news for you. See, this is where the open design of Elden Ring has an advantage over the more linear designs of the previous Souls games. If you got stuck on a boss in those games, at least most of the time, you were basically at its mercy, banging your head against its wall until you either give up or it dies. In Elden Ring, if you get stuck on a boss, you can just go literally anywhere else in the world. By my count, there are only 2 required bosses to get into Leyndell, and from there only 6 to beat the whole game. And in a game with 165 bosses and 30 of those that give achievements, only needing to beat less than a dozen is pretty crazy. And if you run into a boss that you really just want to beat, you can just go away and level up a bit through exploration, and then come back and beat it. Meanwhile, many of the optional Remembrance bosses are some of the hardest bosses in the history of the series. All of this leads to Elden Ring being both the easiest and the hardest FromSoft game to date, and is a shining example of how to do difficulty in games. Real quick, as I said earlier, there was a certain criticism about Elden Ring that I want to address. Yes, there are a ton of bosses, however many of them are unfortunately repeats, or mini-boss versions of regular enemies you can find in the overworld. Now, this is a frustration I can understand, but also one that I can let slide a bit. The enemy designs and animations are some of the best parts of this game. They each feel so fitting to their setting. Sure, some of them may just feel pasted on for the sake of filling up space, but plenty of others feel so intentionally placed to the point where you may try to uncover their small stories for yourself. It only adds on to the exploration factor of the world. The subtle interactions with these mobs that you can have is such an underrated part of the experience. Now, do I still wish that all of the bosses could be unique and interesting? Yes, of course. But at the same time, it also feels impossible to have a world this expansive while still being able to fit that criteria. So I think I can get over it for now and just go somewhere where there isn't an ulcerated tree spirit. So that was my main tangent. Where was I again? Oh yeah. Every boss takes a good amount of skill and a little bit of luck to beat. And if you don't have that skill, well, just summon a couple guys, abuse status, build up attacks, use magic and range more often, explore the world until you're nice and overleveled for everything, and you should be just fine. And if you want to play with a bit more honor and a bit more of a challenge, well, it's easy enough to handicap yourself against any boss. And all of this is possible because all that customization I talked about exists. Every single weapon in this game can be used as an effective means to beat the game based on how you upgrade and build around it. And all of this leads to what I would consider a truly freeing open world experience. A game where you can go anywhere and do anything at a level of difficulty that you choose. And you might be thinking, oh well, games do this all the time. You can choose normal or hardened or veteran at the main menu. You know, what's the big deal? The big deal here is that those aren't real choices. That's the game-changing sliders based on pre-designed difficulties. In Elden Ring, it is truly your choice, and that's what makes an open-world title truly special. This is what open-world games were always meant to be. A giant world that doesn't hold your hand or spoon-feed you a mediocre story. A game that truly lets you go at your own pace, filled with interesting enemies and bosses, decent rewards, the ability to play whatever style you choose, and a lot of cool lore that exists as a backdrop to stitch the world together. What it is not is an excuse for a studio to make easy copy and paste style side quests while also making a world that may look amazing on the outside but will have next to no interaction. So how does this compare with the typical linear game? How does it change the debate? Well, to be honest, I don't know where to go from here. I still don't have the answer. Even after all of this rambling, the war still rages. The Souls community has now turned into the Zelda community, where they got their open world title after years of linearity, so now there's a toxic subset of people who won't even give it a chance. As far as fantasy goes, which is kinda the point of this whole channel, I love the lore and the world building. Actually, a big reason I even bought into the hype for this game was because I heard old George was working on it, and you can definitely see his influence on parts of the story. Those parts, they're all fine, but as far as the game design debate goes, well, it showed me that these types of games can still be worth something, that they can still bring some value into my life. This design style has oversaturated the gaming community, yet at the same time, games like these are proof that they still have the potential to be masterpieces and to be unique from one another. The strength of a linear game lies with its story and its characters, for the most part. And that can take a lot of work to produce, especially when having to graft that story onto a video game. The strength of an open world game lies with its gameplay and its world building. However, once in a while you get a game where all of these elements can merge together. At the end of the day, I don't really like when one of these concepts overshadows the other. That at the moment many studios are choosing the open world route to tell their stories and leaving the linear game design in the dust. Yet, I still find that I can like both and that I still want both. These concepts can merge and coexist, and that's all I really want, I guess. For me, there isn't really an answer to this debate except just make good games, I guess. That's just what I've learned today. Oh, and keep making the medieval fantasy setting. That shit hits good every time. And with that, I think I'll end things here. The point, I guess, or the lesson, is just to make good games. And you, the player, should give games you're unsure about a chance. Linear is good, open world is good. I can't say if one is better than the other, but I will say an open world game has officially become my favorite game of all time over the previous linear game that used to hold that spot, so, you know, make of that what you will.